his last drop pin wasn't even on a road. Like, there's a reason he's gone off road, I think. Like, why has he not carried on the path? He's not a stupid boy, do you know what I mean?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, thoughts build up until I...
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Did you know that the drinking hole the Airbnb dude Kasim, aka Johnny Vegas, took Jay to before calling it a night was just 16 minutes drive? That's less than 5.5 kilometers, which is under 3.5 miles. That's how far away it was from Musca, from their accommodation on Musca, and a very, very windy road from that drinking hole at Santiago del Teide to Musca. This last drive to the Airbnb was likely uppermost in Jay's mind, and perhaps Kasim had said something like, "No worries, mate. Where we're going from here is just 15 minutes away." That is insight number one. Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I'm going to be doing quite a fun analysis, a comparison essentially between Trump's ear, how much of his ear was shot off, and the narrative surrounding Van Gogh's ear. You might find it really interesting. Bear in mind, there'll be an episode of Van Gogh Letters number 87. If you haven't watched any of them, you might want to catch this one. Not everyone's cup of tea, but some people certainly do enjoy it. So look out for that. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So when Jay set off the next morning, he may have had the notion of a 15-minute drive to the next town in his mind, right? Based on Kasim saying to him something like, well, it's just 15 minutes away, or based on that drive that wasn't very long. And so this might be why Brad remembered Jay saying 15 minutes drive, 14-hour walk. By the way, I've collated the mainstream media citing this number, 15 minutes drive. I know there were many of you who said, no, he said 50 minutes drive. And I think virtually every single mainstream media source, the Express, the Mirror, Sky News, everybody referred to this as a 15-minute drive. Now, in a sense, both numbers were accurate in terms of 15 minutes drive, 14-hour walk. The next town was a 16-minute drive away, and his hotel would have been a 14-hour walk if he went along the highway. If he walked along the coast, that would have been the shortest route. Well, then it would have been an 11-hour walk or even less. This might also be how and why Jay wanted to make for the coast. Firstly, the idea that the shortest route back was along the coast. So this idea that go towards the coast and that's going to be the shortest route for you. And then secondly, that by car, where he needed to go was just 15 minutes drive. Jay may have reasoned if the distance was just 15 minutes in terms of driving, a number, as I say, he may have had in his mind from hours earlier, and perhaps from what Kasim had said to him. Well, if he walked the shortest distance, if he just walked directly to the sea, he may have reasoned, if he took shortcuts, it might be a very short walk. On paper, that reasoning was right as well, because the sea from Musca is so close, you can actually see it. It's barely 2 kilometers away, a little bit more than a mile and change away from Musca. And this is where I think it gets interesting. Because Jay wanted to believe the walking distance was wrong, he wanted to believe certain information that didn't suit him was wrong, and that the driving distance was right, he overruled some of what he knew, some of the information that he had, and he decided to walk, even though Brad had suggested catching a taxi.
Were you concerned at that point?
Not at the time, no, because we were both laughing about it. He said, "Look where I am." We were just, he didn't seem concerned on the phone until we knew how far away we were.
Yeah.
I said, "Put your location on." He said, a 15-minute drive or a 14-hour walk. I don't know if it's accurate or not.
Yeah.
So I said to him, "Well, it's only a 15-minute drive."
Well, the part that I was hoping to include in that audio was where Brad suggested catching a taxi, and of course the audio cuts off at that point. Now, the reality, of course, was the opposite. It was the other way around, right? In other words, the driving distance was wrong. It wasn't 15 minutes. And the walking distance was right. It was many, many hours walk. And they chose to reason that it could be the opposite. Are you ready for insight number 2? Why didn't Jay catch a taxi? Well, maybe by the end of a third day of partying and drinking and God knows what else, he'd emptied his wallet or almost emptied it. Perhaps he'd blown his budget. A lot of people go all in and all out on these weekend binge fests, right? And perhaps by the end of it, he felt too proud to ask anyone for money. By the way, I checked the prices for taxis out of there, and they ranged from, are you ready for this? About €180 to as much as €480. That's for one person. And by the way, Uber doesn't seem to be available in Muscat at all, or even from Santiago del Teide. So let's just go back to that. If he couldn't afford a taxi, and as I say, out there in Muscat, a taxi would be pretty expensive. Prices I looked at, as I say, ranged from 180 to €480. Would you pay that amount of money for a taxi? And that's one way. And, if he didn't want to wait for a bus, then walking, if he knew where he was going, and if Los Cristianos was as close as Los Carrizales, and perhaps he misread that sign as well, then walking would have been a viable option. But just as wanting this case to be about foul play doesn't make it about foul play, Jay wanting to believe he was near his destination didn't mean he was. And the further he walked, the clearer it was that not only was he lost, but he wasn't near his destination after all. This realization, which had to be constant realization, wow, I don't know where I am. I'm not getting closer to where I want to be. It offered countless opportunities to simply turn back, and yet Jay elected not to. By the way, on my first trip to America, I do meet someone at a hotel in Big Sky, Montana, but I had to get there myself. The cheapest ride, and this blew my mind, the cheapest ride I could find for a 1-hour transfer from the airport in Bozeman, Montana was something like $400. I think it was perhaps even more expensive. This transfer was more expensive than my flight from New York to Montana, as I remember. Anyway, that brings us to insight number 3. Paying for a ride is the obvious choice, and in his situation, even paying for an expensive ride would have been the obvious choice, if you can afford it. A teenager, an apprentice bricklayer who has been out on the town for 3 days and nights in a row, and who by the end of it has allowed his cell phone battery to run down, possibly also allowed his finances to run down to the limit. Does that make sense? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.